Attacks on Iran aimed at hindering its nuclear program risk triggering a global arms race, encouraging states to ignore constraints and accelerate their pursuit of nuclear weapons. It's an issue Professor Nicholas Wheeler has been writing about. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Birmingham and a non-resident senior fellow at BASIC, and joins me now. Professor Wheeler, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
President Trump has claimed victory. He says his bombs have stopped the nuclear threat from Iran. Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu says they've removed the threat of nuclear annihilation. Are those gentlemen right? Is the world now safer?
Well, they clearly think so, or want us to think so. I mean, the first question, I guess, is, have they actually eliminated the threat? And I think that's really problematic. Because, first of all, it's not clear that all the enriched uranium has actually been obliterated, to use Trump's term. So there's the question about where it actually is. Given that the Americans gave warning before the attack, that obviously provided some window of time for the enriched uranium to be moved to other places. And then, of course, there's the question about whether Iran will now accelerate its weaponization. So Tulsi Gabbard testified in March to Congress that there was no evidence that Iran was engaging in weaponization, because it's important to distinguish between the development of enriched uranium and the actual development of a weapon. And even though the Iranians have, prior to these attacks, a large stockpile of enriched uranium, up to 60%, we think, and maybe more. Yeah, so there's uncertainty about where the uranium is. And then there's the question mark about whether Iran will now make a decision, having been attacked, to weaponize. So my argument would have been that Iran has not gone for full weaponization, believing that that would be the circumstances under which it would be attacked. My argument would also be that it's acquired that stockpile of enriched uranium as a hedge against the uncertain future of perhaps one day it would need that weapon, and it needs to put itself in that position where it could race for the bomb. Also, I think it's wrong to underestimate how far Iran, as a proud and dignified state, believes that it has a right to uranium enrichment and to an indigenous nuclear fuel cycle, whereas the Western states have taken the position since 2003 that Iran shouldn't really have any indigenous nuclear enrichment capability. And that's really been the sort of fault line in the debate. And then what Obama did in the deal in 2015 in the JCPOA was say, okay, Iran can have a limited capability to enrich, but they would scale back the percentage of uranium that was enriched to the higher levels, and there would be intrusive monitoring from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that was the basis of the deal. So it didn't eliminate the threat, but it pushed back the possibility of Iran developing the weapon significantly in terms of the fuel for the bomb, which this was now constraining. And of course, it gave increased and enhanced monitoring powers for the agency to see if there was any weaponization activity taking place. Trump pulled out of that deal in 2018, believing that it wasn't in the US interest. So the question is, having now attacked Iran, will Iranian decision makers calculate that now is the moment to run for the bomb? And will they try to do that? So when you ask the question, is the world safer? It may actually have accelerated these attacks by Israel and crucially the US may actually have accelerated Iran's determination to acquire the weapon and to take those steps. And they may have clandestine enrichment facilities that we know nothing about. It's a big country. And so that's obviously an important factor in this argument about is the world safer. The more general point, which we made in the article that myself and my colleague at Birmingham, David Dunn, wrote in The Conversation, last week, is about the risk of this accelerating proliferation more generally. I'm
just thinking about from Tehran's point of view, what would be the argument to try and keep them cooperating with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? They seem minded to block the IAEA for now.
Well, I think their calculation has to be, if they do try to develop the weapon and that becomes openly known, then of course they risk further attacks and further strikes. And it becomes much easier for those people attacking them to legitimize and justify what they're doing. So if Iran, wants to maintain international public opinion more on its side, and if it wants to show that it's living up still to its obligations, then it may be in its interests not to leave the treaty and to risk sanctions and all the consequences that would bring. And as I say, I think if they were to accelerate for the weapon, they do risk, of course, increased attacks. And it becomes harder to criticize the United States for attacking them, as we did last week, if Iran is actually trying to develop a weapon in defiance of the NPT. The issue of the Board of Governors, which is the states that make up the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of it, passing this resolution on the 12th of June, is in relation to undeclared sites where the IAEA has found traces of uranium. But this is not recent. This goes back a while. And basically, it's the failure of Iran to sufficiently comply with the agency that's led to the board passing this resolution. But I would emphasize that the Western states, the US, the UK, and France, have been very prominent in pushing for that resolution. And then, they got that agreement from the board that Iran would be found in non-compliance. The last time that happened was 2005. And then the file was sent to the Security Council. And it was in that context in 2006 that the Security Council first imposed mandatory Chapter 7 sanctions on Iran. So I think that board resolution has to be seen in the context of the ongoing talks with Iran, the US determination to try to get a better deal, and the general concerns about an Iranian bomb that have been growing ever since the Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. The restraints then obviously broke down. The Iranians stopped complying with their part of it. And then, of course, the problem is, well, then what are you going to do about a situation where you've got an unconstrained Iranian capability? So capability in the sense of this enrichment level, the fuel, if you want, for the bomb. But the actual turning that fuel into a weapon is not as straightforward as it might sound. And it takes time. And of course, a lot of those steps can potentially be detected. Yeah.
As you say, Iran for decades has been signed up to those structures of nuclear diplomacy.
Yeah.
And this came in the middle of talks with Steve Witkoff on behalf of the US around that nuclear program. Is there a situation where this acting while talks are ongoing will be seen as kind of bad faith by the Iranians?
Well, I'm sure that they see it as bad faith in the sense that they obviously felt they were in negotiations. But I think the way I would frame it is that this is an attempt by the United States to massively improve its bargaining position in any process of this kind, and also in the context of Israel being given a green light by the Trump administration to strike, which I think is the right way to read that, whereas Biden had not been prepared to support Netanyahu in this kind of thing. And now Trump, I'm sure, will hope that, that on the back of this ceasefire that, he's proclaiming, that the Iranians will now be much more willing to offer the kind of deal. But the problem with that is that if in the end the American position is zero enrichment, which is what it was prior to Obama finally deciding in 2015 that they would allow some degree of enrichment, I do find it hard, unless the Iranians are really on the ropes and have no cards to play, so to speak, that they will agree to that, because I think that would be such a massive capitulation. And it seems hard to imagine that they would agree to that. So I'm not entirely convinced that this strike is going to achieve the kind of goals ultimately that Trump thinks it will. And if there is some kind of deal that allows the Iranians some limited degree of enrichment, as there was before, then potentially you're back to where you were kind of when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, really, in the sense that, you've still got the fundamental problem that Iran could potentially have undeclared sites. It would depend what monitoring there is. It would also depend where all that enrichment capability has actually gone. How far is Fordo really shut down, and the Natanz? And it will also depend upon to what extent ultimately the Iranians now decide this is the moment to try to weaponize, and because they have enough enriched uranium, probably if enriched to 90%, people are estimating that they could have somewhere between 10 and 15 nuclear bombs. I mean, that's obviously a massive, would be a massive transformation of the position in the region.
How will other countries, perhaps ones with nuclear-armed neighbours, thinking of places like Saudi Arabia, or the likes of North Korea, be looking at what's been going on in the last weeks?
Well, I think the general picture, is one in which the signal that's clearly sent is that if you don't have nuclear weapons, you make yourself vulnerable to regime change and military action. And I think that lesson is being learned over and over again. So you go back to Iraq in 2003, Saddam didn't have nuclear weapons. You go to Libya in 2011, Libya, Gaddafi had actually given up his program in 2003 to try and come back in after the Lockerbie bombing. And of course, you look at Ukraine, 2022. Ukraine, of course, gave up insofar as it controlled these weapons, which is a bit of an exaggeration to some degree. But Ukraine gave up its strategic nuclear forces that were on its territory as part of the dissolution of the former Soviet Union and it joining the NPT and becoming part of as a new successor state to the Soviet Union, as one of the republics of the former Soviet Union becoming independent and sovereign. And now you have this. So people out there are going to look at it and say, but look at North Korea. North Korea left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, tested a nuclear device in 2006, and hasn't actually been attacked or had any military use of force against it. So the lesson that clearly these strikes show, I think, and which is why it's such a dangerous development for me, is that it really underlines the argument that if you want to be secure in dangerous neighborhoods, then national nuclear capabilities become extremely important. And of course, all of this is taking place in the context of growing uncertainties about American nuclear extended deterrence. So you've got, people in Poland, senior people, like the Prime Minister, raising questions about, whether Poland might need some kind of capability in the future. You've got debates about whether Europe needs to start thinking about some kind of independent nuclear capability separate from the US to protect it against, future Russian aggression after Ukraine. You've got people in South Korea and Japan questioning whether in the face of growing North Korean and Chinese nuclear capabilities, the United States can really be relied upon ultimately in a crisis to sacrifice Chicago for Seoul or Tokyo. The same question that de Gaulle asked Kennedy all those years ago in 1960, would the United States really be prepared to sacrifice New York for Paris? So those debates that have been around for a long time are now being, I would say, are now being asked. Questions around extended nuclear deterrence are being asked today in a way that they haven't been asked for a long time in the context. So growing doubts about that American extended deterrence, particularly around Trump's unpredictability, the things he said, lines, well, we won't protect you unless you, pay your bills, and all these things that are not how you talk to your partners if you want to make them feel that your guarantee can be trusted. So if you take those two sort of things, on the one hand, people are more and more exposed. If they don't have nuclear weapons, there's clear examples that regime change and military action taken place against those states that didn't have them. And then you underline that with, concerns about extended nuclear deterrence. And suddenly the proliferation picture starts to look really quite concerning and alarming. And I think a lot of people are now worried that proliferation is more likely in the next 10, 15, 20 years, where potentially you could see another half dozen, maybe more nuclear armed states And that starts to raise all sorts of concerns about just how what people are calling the third nuclear age, just how stable that might be.
What is the solution here? Are there alternatives beyond bombing these nuclear programs out of existence, or is there just a starting pistol on a new nuclear arms race?
That's a good question. I would say that I do a lot of work in my research on the challenges of building trust between nuclear armed adversaries, and one of the starting points for thinking about that increasingly is that you can't begin to build trust until you've actually dissolved distrust. And the Secretary General talked at the opening of the last Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference about the need to replace distrust with dialogue. So, I think in the end, if the risks of nuclear conflict and nuclear proliferation are to be rolled back, and if we're to see some kind of marginalization of nuclear weapons in international relations rather than what we're seeing, which is an increasing salience of nuclear weapons, then it's going to require the major nuclear armed states to radically transform their relationships. What I mean by that is in the end, we got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the late 1960s because the United States and the Soviet Union recognized a common interest in reducing nuclear risks. You need a similar common consciousness of the importance of restraint at the highest levels of nuclear diplomacy. And at the moment, that's extremely difficult to get because the United States and Russia, up until Trump came in, have been mired in deep distrust. We just don't know what the trajectory of the US-Russian relationship is going to be. It is possible, of course, that Trump will form some kind of partnership with Putin, and actually, that will reduce the risks of nuclear conflict between the US and Russia, but then that will leave the Europeans really exposed, and that will underline their fears of abandonment, and then will raise all sorts of questions about what they might do about that. And then, of course, there's the question of how the US-China relationship will unfold, and of course, how the United States ultimately manages the relationship between Russia and China. And in nuclear terms, the US is increasingly worried about what happens if it's actually dealing with a Russia and a China who are actually aligned, and then either they both act against US interests at the same time, or there's some degree of collusion, or the Americans find themselves having to deal with a major crisis over Taiwan, say, but then there's Russian mischief making somewhere else, and this stretches the US. And so there's a lot of concerns in the military nuclear strategy planning side of the US administration about just how they manage all this. So in the absence of the kind of cooperation and consciousness of common interest and recognition of the importance of restraint, and if you think about the other dimension we haven't talked about is that the arms control regime is in tatters. The guardrails are fundamentally falling apart. And in the end, arms control is predicated on the idea that adversaries can share a common interest in restraint. If you don't have that sense of common interest, placing a common value on security of one another, then it's extremely difficult. And we wouldn't have got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as I say, without that shift in the US-Soviet relationship. So we came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous crisis to date, but that actually then opened up a space for cooperation between the two sides. We had the Partial Test Ban Treaty in '63, we had the Hotline Agreement, and that laid the groundwork through the 18-nation disarmament conference for what becomes the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So my answer would be that unless there is that shift at the very highest levels, it's very difficult. But we shouldn't say never, in international politics, because in 1983, Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. In November 1985, he sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva, and they talked about a nuclear war, must never be fought and can never be won. And they started a journey that actually was critical to the end of the Cold War. So there are possibilities and moments in history that open up, but at the moment, I think it's not unreasonable to be pessimistic about the risks of nuclear conflict. And I think we're at the most danger. I sometimes ask people whether, because I grew up as a student in sort of in the early 80s, and I sometimes ask, friends and colleagues, is this more dangerous than 1983? I think it's certainly the most dangerous point since 1983, even if it's not more dangerous. And so the need for bringing restraint to bear on these questions, I think, has never been more urgent.
Professor Nicholas Wheeler at the University of Birmingham, I'm really grateful for your time today.
Thank you. It's been really interesting.